Hello everyone, welcome to this EU Cross webinar. I am Andrione-Moylan from the Leuven Centre for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven, and I will be moderating this webinar entitled The UK and EU Foreign Security and Defence Policy Relationship After Brexit, with Richard Whitman, Professor at Kent University in Canterbury, and Kolja Raube, Assistant Professor at the University of Leuven. Richard Whitman is Professor of Politics and International Relations and Director of the Global Europe Centre at the University of Kent. He's also an Associate Fellow and former head of the Europe Programme at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House. He is also lead editor of the Journal of Common Market Studies and was elected as an academician of the British Academy of Social Sciences in 2007. As well as elected as chair of the British International Studies Association in 2017 and 2018. Professor Whitman is a regular international media commentator and has also often been called to give evidence to the UK Parliament on UK and EU foreign and security issues. Here in Leuven, we have a long-standing collaboration with Professor Whitman, also in the context of the Erasmus Plus network NORSHA on research and teaching on EU foreign affairs. We're very pleased you could join us today, Richard.
Thank you very much. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to join you all virtually. And I'm very grateful to those who are listening, nearly 100 of you as far as I can see. I'm impressed that...
Richard, might I just introduce briefly Kolja as well?
Sure.
Who will be participating as discussant, and who is Assistant Professor for European Studies at the University of Leuven, where he's also Programme Coordinator of the Master of European Studies. He's also Adjunct Professor at the American University, Washington, DC, Brussels campus, and Visiting Professor at Kobe University in Japan, as well as Visiting Research Fellow at the EU Studies Centre at the University of Illinois. Kolja Raube has published widely on the European Parliament, interparliamentary cooperation in the European Union, and global governance, as well as security policies, the rule of law, legitimacy, and coherence in EU external action. So also very glad you could join us today, Kolja. As for the general structure of this webinar, we will have the presentation from Professor Whitman for about 50 minutes, and then we will give the floor to Professor Raube, who will share with us a few thoughts and comments, and Professor Whitman will then have the opportunity to reply. As always, during the presentations, you may send your questions to me via the webinar chat box, which you can access from the control panel. After the presentations, I will bring your questions into the discussion and allow our speakers to respond. It's my great pleasure now to give the floor to our distinguished speaker, Professor Richard Whitman. We very much look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you virtually. It seems rather strange to be talking about Brexit or a Brexit issue in the context that we find ourselves, but of course, Brexit hasn't gone away. And the topic that I want to focus on, the foreign security and defence policy relationship between the UK and the EU, I think has been something of a Cinderella topic on Brexit. So I think it would be interesting for us to reflect on and to discuss how we see this issue within the broader Brexit story, but also how we see it within the future UK and EU relationship. And what I want to do is, first of all, to perhaps wind the clock back a little bit and talk about how the UK sort of sat within the EU on foreign security and defence policy issues. And the rationale for that is just to remind ourselves as to, let's say, the slightly awkward positioning of the UK on many issues, but also its approach towards foreign security and defence policy issues, and whether they help us in any way to think about the future relationship. Then I want to talk about what I call the Brexit interregnum, this is really because Brexit itself is essentially a process which has many phases, and we're in what I call an interregnum phase, and I'll clarify what I mean by that in a moment. But we're also, of course, in the transition period in the relationship, the formal transition period, in the sense that the UK is obviously left the EU, but until the end of this calendar year, on current arrangements under the withdrawal agreement between the EU and the UK, the UK will or has been put in a very unusual relationship to the EU. And I want to reflect a little bit on that relationship, and then talk about the future in the second half of my remarks. The future first in terms of the political declaration, which was agreed alongside the withdrawal agreement, and sets out exactly how the two sides should seek to reach an agreement in this area, and the basis of what should be the guiding ideas for the future relationship. Look a little bit at existing third country models to reflect on how or whether the UK actually fits with existing third country models, and then pull back a bit and think about what I call some of the phase 2 issues, which are not just the negotiation issues in the phase 2 of the Brexit negotiations on the future relationship, but the broader questions around the way in which the UK fits in its relationship with the EU and its member states, but also within Europe more generally. And obviously, I hope that in the course of these different segments that I'll be able to stimulate some reaction and some remarks from yourselves. I really look forward to hearing from those of you who are with us. So let me just turn first of all to the relationship between the EU and the UK, just to refresh ourselves in terms of the way in which the UK had kind of functioned in this area as a member state. I mean, you'll all be aware, I think, of the UK's somewhat difficult relationship to European integration. And within that, you know, I think the UK had a distinctive approach towards foreign security cooperation within the EU, and was in many respects a sort of differentiated member state. And I think where you see that differentiation, where you see that difference, is slightly different across foreign policy issues from security and defence policy cooperation within the EU framework. And if you take foreign policy first of all, I think it's probably fair to say that the UK had a particular preference when it came to foreign policy cooperation, what I call flexible Brusselsization. And what I mean by that is that the UK was rather sceptical on questions of a sort of treaty-based approach towards foreign policy cooperation, although of course it accepted the letter and the spirit of the treaties. It didn't really approach foreign policy cooperation on the basis that ongoing treaty reform was the best way to solve the problems in the functioning of EU foreign policy, but rather had a preference for looking at the ways in which you could more closely cooperate within Brussels on a much more intergovernmental basis. And I think there's lots of examples of the way that UK approached treaty reform, you know, through Maastricht, Amsterdam, Nice and Lisbon, that I think really chimes with this idea that the UK had a particular approach both on functioning but also on the reform of the foreign policy making system within the EU. If you look at defence, obviously defence, security and defence policy cooperation in the EU has had a different set of arrangements from foreign policy, the foreign policy relationship. They are inseparable but separate, if you like. But here again, I mean, the UK's approach, I think, was quite distinctive in terms of the kinds of things that it favoured. It was very focused on a capabilities driven approach rather than what you might call a kind of political, a broad political objective approach in terms of seeing defence integration as part of a project for enhancing integration on the part of the member states. And I think the UK very much shared the analysis that was made by Madeleine Albright when she was US Secretary of State, a concern about the decoupling of EU defence developments from NATO, a concern about duplication when it came to capabilities developed within the EU framework and those within the NATO framework, and worried, and this perhaps is ironic, worried about discrimination between European members of NATO who are non-EU members and EU member states. So I think that analysis, that US analysis, was one that I think the UK broadly shared. But I think it also perhaps is worth clarifying what the UK preference was. So it wasn't just opposition, but there was, I think, a clear set of preferences, and I call those the 3 Cs, which were to see European security and defence policy develop in ways that were complementary to NATO. In other words, to see the development of the European defence capability, and I think this is the case from Saint-Malo onwards, develop in ways which were not intended to in any way undermine NATO, but were intended to add something which wasn't there, and make it possible for Europeans to do things they couldn't necessarily do within the NATO framework. I think my second C is that the UK was quite interested in, this follows on from the first C, the complementarity, is the ways in which the EU could develop a competitive advantage on European security questions, and having a particular interest in civilian crisis management, which tied into an approach that the UK evolved through the stabilisation unit, how you brought military and civilian capabilities together, and seeing the EU as having a competitive advantage in that respect in comparison to NATO. And thirdly, I think the UK had a strong preference for what I call in ways in which you could boost capabilities of member states through cooperation and particularly to, as the UK would see it, sort of raise their game or raise their ability, and that's where sort of enthusiasm for battle groups came from, and also the idea of coalitions of the willing and able, when it was possible to do things together with a group of states to do that, rather than be driven by what I think the UK would see as a more sort of theological approach towards European security and defence cooperation, which is to focus on institutional questions. And all in all, or in summary, I think that the UK position on sort of security and defence cooperation was really in opposition to presentism, which you'd often hear expressed in London, the idea that perhaps some member states were very, very keen to participate in things like CSDP operations, but that didn't necessarily mean that they made some of the difficult choices that were necessary if you were going to have more enhanced European security and defence capabilities, including, for example, spending more money. So I think you can see quite a distinctive approach that the UK adopted towards foreign security and defence policy cooperation for the period in which it was a member. And obviously that position evolved, and there were nuances as both the CFSP and the CSDP themselves evolved and took on different complexion and different complexity. But I think that's worth reminding ourselves that the UK had a particular approach, and I think for many commentators that was often seen in a pejorative way, in which the UK was perhaps negative when it came to reform proposals, or even in terms of providing capabilities when it came to, for example, personnel on CSDP missions. Yeah, I at the start mentioned this idea of a Brexit interregnum. Well, what I have in mind here is that it was obviously it's ended up being a very extended process, Brexit, and many would say it's become possibly a state of being for the UK. And that's really a period which has lasted right from the June 2016 vote and continues now. And I don't think we'll be out of this interregnum really until the end of the transition period, but also until a future relationship has been agreed between the EU and the UK. And for historians, interregnums are bridging periods. They're periods where you see a change from one kind of status to another. And I think in the foreign security and defence policy area, what we've seen through this period is that the UK has become a more differentiated integration state. I'll come back to this in a moment. The way that the UK has withdrew from activity even when it was a member state, really anticipating its departure from the EU. And through the transition process, it's become essentially an associated member state, associated with foreign and security policy. That's the condition that we find ourselves in now, since the UK's departure at the beginning of this year, rather. And we've also seen ourselves in a position where we're moving to possible greater detachment and even contestation on foreign security policy issues, which is not where I think the British government intended things to be. And if you look back particularly to the May government, where it's floated all sorts of proposals in terms of a close security and defence policy arrangement through both government documents that were produced, but also speeches that Theresa May made, not least the speech made in Florence, but also at the Munich Security Conference. I think with the Johnson administration, we've ended up in a rather different place from, I think, where certainly I expected things to be at this point in the to flesh that out a little bit more over the next 15 minutes or so. So where we are at the moment is that we've obviously seen the UK and the EU agree on the withdrawal agreement. The withdrawal agreement, addressing all the issues associated with the UK's departure, what some people have called the divorce issues, and the UK enter into this transition process where it's no longer a participant in EU decision-making processes, but is in effect bound by EU decisions, bound by EU law and EU policies, but obviously not playing a part in policy formulation. And that's true for foreign and security policy as much as it's true for other areas. And through the Article 50 withdrawal agreement negotiation period and through the transition, it was originally envisaged that you would have a new EU-UK foreign and security policy relationship worked out as an easy area to get an agreement on, and one that might even have come into force prior to the withdrawal agreement not being reached, rather. That obviously wasn't the case, and as we're all aware, the withdrawal agreement's a rather prolonged process. So we've ended up in a rather awkward situation, I think, in this policy area where the transition provisions have kicked in a way that it wasn't necessarily anticipated that they would be the basis for the UK connecting to the EU. We have a new EU-UK agreement still to be put in place, which is intended to include a foreign policy aspect, foreign security policy aspect, although perhaps we can have a discussion as to what that future agreement might actually look like in terms of what's possible in the time that's available for those negotiations. but there will also be some kind of provisional implementation period pending ratification, particularly if it's a mixed agreement. And therefore, we're going to go through quite some extra phases, I would suggest, before it's really clear in the foreign security and defence policy area, and probably more broadly in the relationship between the EU and the UK, what the kind of guiding principles and the characteristic of cooperation between the two sides is within this area. So this interregnum process for me is stretched somewhat longer than what I certainly originally anticipated, and we're not yet at the end of that process. Just to turn to transition first, and transition is a first for the EU, of course, because this is the first occasion on which we've had a member state leave on the basis of the Article 50 provisions. And transition was not something that was originally envisaged under Article 50, but an idea that emerged as a consequence of the realization of the difficulties of dealing with a member state departing on the terms that were provided for under Article 50. In other words, allowing for a period of time which you would bridge withdrawal and before a future relationship agreement would be put in place. And I think it's interesting because it creates a different kind of relationship between the EU and a third country, in this case, the UK. And it has some interesting moving parts, I think, in the foreign security policy area, in that it puts the UK into a kind of peculiar privileged partner status with the EU. For those who have been studying European foreign policy cooperation for some time, we used to talk about the relationship between the EU and third countries as a relationship in the foreign policy areas is relationship by facts, which is that third countries would be advised of what EU foreign policy positions were, and then be able to sign up to or to agree to those, but obviously not be involved in the decision. But they could append their names or their country to an EU foreign policy position. We've ended up with a position on the foreign policy area in which the UK has obviously left all of the decision-making bodies and institutions that the EU uses for making foreign policy decisions under the CFSP, although there are provisions for invitation. But the UK is intended to be bound by those foreign policy decisions, that it hasn't taken part in deciding for new decisions, and obviously for past decisions where it remains bound by those, except where it makes the case for an opt-out or an exception, which hasn't been utilised so far. But there is a provision to do so. On the CSDP side, we have, again, an unusual situation. And I've on the slide, I've described this as a reverse Denmark, which is not strictly true, but Denmark is obviously out of the CSDP as a consequence of the opt-out that it enjoys in that policy area. The UK remains within the area, although its level of participation is odd. And putting it crudely, it continues to pay for CSDP activity where it's apportioned to member states. But in the period from June 2016 onwards, the UK gradually unwound its relationship from the CSDP by ending the role that it had, for example, in providing commanders or heads for operations, the operational headquarters that it provided for the Atalanta mission in Northwood in the UK moved out of the UK. And its role in the battle groups also ended, and it was removed from the battle group roster. And obviously, PESCO and the PESCO process, or the revitalized PESCO process, was negotiated before the UK's departure, but the UK remained outside of that process also. Now, all of these transition arrangements, unlike most other areas covered by the withdrawal agreement, can be ended if a future relationship for foreign security policy is put in place before the end of the transition period. But I think it's a very unlikely proposition we'll have that agreement in place. So the transition arrangements will hold. And of course, if transition is extended, I mean, the British government view at the moment is that transition should not be extended, an agreement should be reached on the future relationship, and it will have to take a view, or the EU and the UK will have to take a view by June as to whether they want to see transition extended. The arrangements that I've just described would continue to be in place for much longer, and until a future relationship is determined in this area, which again may be shorter than the extended transition process. But as I say, it's interesting because it's codified as a particular kind of differentiated relationship for a third country, where the UK is a kind of living dead member of the EU in this policy area. It bears many of the responsibilities and has obviously taken that on board as not a permanent state of affairs, but just through this relationship, or this bridging period between departing the EU and the future relationship being negotiated. Now, if we turn to the second part of what I want to say, which is to start to tread on questions of the future. And as you'll be aware, the relationship between the EU and the UK in negotiating Brexit was primarily focused on the withdrawal agreement and the issues that the withdrawal agreement were intended to address in terms of money, citizenship, Northern Ireland, and so on. The political declaration agreed at the same time set out the ambitions for the future relationship. And if we dig into that on the foreign and security policy area, there is impressive rhetoric in terms of the idea that you would have this ambitious you'd have a high level of cooperation on the part of both sides, and that's straddling both internal issues, but at the same time, it would also be that you would make or put in place arrangements to allow for arrangements to allow for internal and external kind of package, if you like. So in the political declarations, these are described in the same kinds of terms. But key aspect here, certainly for the UK, has been to preserve this idea that sovereignty is maintained on the part of the UK, and therefore whatever is agreed doesn't limit the UK's room for manoeuvre. The relationship is also supposed to be one in this area which is scalable and flexible. In other words, not a static relationship, and one that allows for, as I would see it in the terms of the declaration, a kind of dynamic form of cooperation. And when we come to look at some of the existing third country relationships, I'm not sure whether any of the existing models would fit with that idea. And if you dig in with a bit more detail when the political declaration gets more specific in terms of the format that's envisaged for cooperation, both in terms of dialogue on foreign policy issues, so-called political dialogue commitments, I see this as being not really more ambitious than existing third country relationships that the EU already has in place. There's nothing here that suggests that you would have any kind of special and privileged role or partnership with the UK on foreign policy or exchange of views on foreign policy. And ditto when it comes to the CSDP. You know, there's reference to a framework agreement on CSDP, which provides for, you know, a third country, as already exists for third countries, to participate with the EU on the basis of a continuing third country type relationship. So again, nothing special in the political declaration. I think it actually, if you put the rhetoric to one side, it has a rather unambitious set of aims within the negotiations, or for the negotiations rather. And you can see this carried through into the relationship that's intended to be in place for the European Defence Agency, where again there's talk of an administrative agreement, which is similar or in the same terms as other third countries such as Norway cooperate with the EU on the EDF, the European Defence Fund. Again here, you know, it doesn't seem to be the case that the UK as being offered any special favours. And I think also you see the same when it comes to PESCO and the idea that the UK might be associated with PESCO on an exceptional basis. It's probably worth just flagging up at this stage the issue of Galileo, and this was a difficult, or rather, I think for the UK, an enlightening experience during the withdrawal agreement negotiations, where the UK being faced with the realization that its relationship to Galileo as a non-member state was going to be different from what it had anticipated, and obviously what it had enjoyed as a member state, particularly access to the public regulated service. And so there was a little bit of tweaking of the political declaration to take account of what I think was a pretty bruising episode for the UK. But again, I think the devil would be in the detail in terms of how future cooperation in that area would actually end up being worked through. So we've got in the political declaration, I think, in summary, sort of quite a high level of sort of rhetorical commitment, shall we say, to a close relationship. But when you dig into the political declaration, which is intended to guide the negotiations which are ongoing at the moment, you, I think, see that there is a much more modest set of offerings on the table. And bearing in mind that that document was obviously one that was agreed mutually between the EU and the UK. So turning to, perhaps the question is as to whether we can get any indication from existing third country relationships as to how the UK relates to the EU by looking at other third country arrangements which are currently in place. We take just three of these as indicative of the fact there are different kind of relationships. You've got, for example, in the Canada case, where the CETA agreement has alongside it a strategic partnership agreement, which is very detailed in terms of the areas for collaboration between the EU and Canada. Sets out quite a lot of ambition, I would say, in a almost sort of quasi-legislative sense in terms of setting out how and where the two sides might seek to work together on foreign policy issues. Is that a model for the UK-EU relationship? Well, I think there's been a bit of discussion within the UK, certainly examination on the part of parliamentarians and government, and that model, that SPA type setup, is not thought to be particularly attractive, an attractive one for the UK, as it seemed to be quite cumbersome and doesn't really provide for the kind of flexibility in consultation that the UK is or would look for. And actually, I think the US model, which is much less codified, but there is regular ongoing consultation on a range of issues, but in a much less codified way. As I say on this diagram, sort of high tempo relationship is, I think, that one that's viewed in a much more attractive fashion. I think a Norway-style relationship where Norway is associated with the EU, and this is, I think, not dissimilar to where we've ended up in the transition process, where the role that might be played by a third country in decision making is rather light in an LITE sense, as in American beer, which has virtually no punch, probably very little taste as well. That proposition or that model is also not seen to be particularly attractive within the UK. And obviously, in both the Norway and the Canada, and one might say in the USA cases, they also run alongside different kinds of trading relationships between the EU and the UK. And the discussion in the UK at some point around a Canada Plus type deal certainly didn't seem to go with the idea of a Canada type strategic partnership agreement between the EU and the UK. And just perhaps to flesh this out, and as you can see from the source at the bottom, the research is not mine. You can see that the EU has a significant range of different kind of relationships with third countries, of which Norway's is probably the most developed of all of those, but I think most commentators who look at that kind of relationship suggest that it isn't one that's really given Norway a decision shaping role, and certainly decision shaping role in a way that London has seen as being attractive as a proposition for the UK to model itself on. So if we put the question of an existing model being picked up as the basis for the UK to one side, and think a little bit about what the characteristics of the future relationship might look and feel like, it's obviously clear that we're going through an exercise in recalibration, and without the COVID pandemic, we could speculate on areas in which there may have been tension between the EU and the UK on foreign policy issues, but obviously I think that's been extinguished as a consequence of the current difficulties we find ourselves within. I think it's also interesting to reflect on to what extent there have been, I think, fairly nascent debates within other member states as to the way in which they want to see the future EU-UK relationship work. It's obviously been the case that the Commission in the lead role for negotiations has articulated different ideas as to what the relationship might look like. And I'll come back a little bit later to where we do see some sort of quite public member state articulation of what the future relationship between the UK and those countries might look like, but not really in an EU sense, with one important exception. And for the UK itself, you know, the UK hasn't really yet worked through what its broader European diplomatic strategy is intended to be post-Brexit. The UK and the UK political and civil service have been preoccupied with the act of Brexit itself, and there hasn't really been extensive bandwidth for looking at how the UK fits within or what the UK's broader strategy for Europe is outside the EU. And I think that was indicated very clearly with an inquiry that the UK Foreign Affairs Select Committee in the House of Commons did, where it's struggling or has been struggling to investigate what the idea of global Britain might be, but took a look at European questions, and I think ended up sort of struggling to understand what the UK's future ambitions might be and how they might be pursued. But I think it's a reasonable assumption to assume the UK will continue to have an interest in EU foreign policy making and policy development. But that's obviously going to be on a very different basis as a non-member state. And I don't think that so far the transition process provides us any clear indication or any clear understanding as to how that basis might actually function. And I think this, to me, gets us to why we face significant negotiation challenges between the EU and the UK in this area. And I think I've already suggested that there's a lack of an attractive template. But I also think that, that the UK certainly did, I'm not sure whether that's still entirely the case, had quite significant ambitions in foreign policy cooperation. But obviously the EU's red line's been very clear in the position between a member state and a non-member state. I think the Johnson administration hasn't made the same kind of noises that the May administration has in this area, which means the UK ambitions, I think, are probably dialed down since the withdrawal agreement negotiations were finally concluded. But also, of course, and this is a major order challenge, I think, for the UK, is that obviously the EU's defence and security ambitions have significantly stepped up since the global strategy was put in place and the strategic autonomy ambition and the moves towards something that looks and feels like a defence union with its various facilitators, shall we say, the Security and Defence Implementation Plan, Defence Action Plan, and so on, PESCO and EDF and CARD, all being arrangements in place. And this focus on the defence technological and industrial base, which, because it includes areas covered by the treaties and treaty-based cooperation, is particularly difficult for the UK to connect into if it has its continuing difficulty with a relationship to EU law and adjudication by the Court of Justice. And that's particularly acute, of course, in the area of the relationship between external and internal security, where the questions of EU law are absolutely central and integral. And again, where the ambitions for cooperation on the part of the British government, to me, look to be very unlikely to be realised. And we also have the shadow of the Galileo experience, which I think probably did quite a lot to take those who are very enthusiastic, certainly in the civil service, foreign policy making community in the UK, enthusiastic for a close relationship, and really undermined their ability to make that strong argument within Whitehall and within Westminster. And Brexit is, of course, and this is again something that isn't perhaps reflected on as much as might be, is a major remodeling or re-envisaging or remapping process of Europe for the UK. Less so, I think, for the other member states. But how does the UK start to evolve a way of thinking about Europe and how the UK connects into Europe, and particularly Europe where the European Union remains preeminent actor. And for me, the issues for the UK as we move through the negotiations, and even beyond the negotiations, is where I think you can see experimentation, and we're seeing a little bit of experimentation on the part of the UK already, or we certainly did before the COVID pandemic took hold. You know, the UK exploring what you call venue shopping, looking at ways in which it could perhaps achieve some of the foreign policies objectives that it wants to on European questions outside of the EU. And some formats being what I would call the organised ad hoc, such as the E3, which I'll come back to in a little while. But also, you know, how far the UK is going to be able to pursue its foreign policy objectives that it has for the EU, if you like, through NATO or the G7 and the UN. But also what areas that the UK is going to be much more of a free rider on. You know, other policy areas that the UK pursued through the EU as a consequence of EU membership in the Western Balkans, for example, that the UK suddenly finds that it doesn't have much of a say on, so it adopts a free rider type position. And all of these we could speculate on, and I think it's too early perhaps to come to a very definitive view based on fairly sketchy evidence. But I think there's enough to suggest that there is already an emergent set of approaches that the UK is adopting. But still, I think there is this unresolved question as to how this fits within the broader sort of global Britain objectives, you know, Europe against the focus on the rest of the world, which was very high in the political rhetoric of the UK government in the course of the Brexit negotiations, but is tended to be much more of a placeholder concept than something where I think you can point to a range of significant outcomes as a consequence of being guided by that as a policy objective. But foreign security policy is an area where I think the British government hopes that there's the possibility to do relationships in a different way, because the UK is seen to be, you know, a significant player in that area. I mean, as you may recall, and I think it's the NATO Secretary General has reminded NATO member states, you know, the UK has a significant defence budget, and now 80% of NATO's defence expenditure comes from the non-EU members of the alliance. The UK has sort of shifted the dial on that. So there are some changes which have taken place, which are systemic or structural changes. The UK obviously wants to see security and defence policy, and one of the routes that it can build privileged partnerships outside the EU framework. But you know, this may become more and more difficult if the ambitions for EU defence integration hold. And I think it also explains why the UK is not averse to the idea of other frameworks suggested by others, such as the E2I, European Intervention Initiative, the French initiative to do cooperation outside the EU framework, not to make trouble on the part of the UK side, because I think they're relatively cost-free ways of the UK venturing some interest in a format that may or may not come to fruition, but may hold some possibility for the future as an alternative or parallel arrangements to the EU. But it's also worth reflecting on the fact that the UK itself has embarked on, although it's now really suspended, a process of integrated security, defence and foreign policy review, which is a more ambitious process than its normal 5-year process of reviewing its security and defence policy objectives. But it's thrown foreign policy into the mix this time. And I think the UK for quite some time has tended to cruise a bit on how foreign policy or diplomacy fits into its security and defence policy. So the UK may also be retooling, rethinking the way that the component parts of its foreign and defence policy arrangements fit in bilateral and in other ways. And those other ways include the relationship with London, Paris, and Berlin. And many of you may be aware that certainly there's been some signaling from both Berlin and Paris that the E3 arrangement, which grew out of the Iran nuclear diplomacy, is an arrangement that could allow for greater cooperation between those three capitals. And certainly I think for the UK, what I call a new polycentrism may well be the preferred arrangement for doing foreign policy relationships with EU and other member states, with all sorts of new bilateralisms and minilateralisms in place to try and use these as approaches that compensate for being outside the EU framework and the efficiency gains that the UK got from being or connecting with more and more, with a large number of countries within a framework that allowed for quite a lot of business to be done in a relatively efficient fashion. So the paradox being, of course, that on leaving the EU, that Europe and EU-Europe occupies more bandwidth for British diplomacy than was the case previously, because there's a lot of running to stay still in terms of using all sorts of other frameworks. Two other points before I pull things to a close. I mean, I focused a lot on the withdrawal agreement, political declaration aspects of the possible organising framework for the future relationship, but we've also had the proposition of a European Security Council idea promoted most I think dramatically by Mr. Macron, and there are obviously different visions of the European Security Council idea out there, some including the UK, but probably most not. And how does that fit into a future future architecture of a relationship between the EU and the UK? It may solve some problems. For example, it may be a way of addressing the temptation, shall we say, of an E3 directoire arrangement being strengthened, but does it lead to a relationship that's good on the EU side? I mean, this is a broader debate for the EU, but there is obviously this UK question. And the fact that the UK has been put in the team as a possible member, how does that relate to ideas about the EU-UK interface, as you find in the political declaration? And there is, the E3 format, which, as I've suggested, there's been a bit of a love-in on this format in terms of governmental speeches and statements from both Berlin and Paris. But also, if you look across time, and this is the subject of a paper shortly to come out, I'm writing with some colleagues at Chatham House, is that you've seen the E3 framework broaden in terms of the issues that it's tackled, even if there hasn't been an increase in the institutionalization of that particular format. But it seems to be a format that London, Paris, and Berlin feel quite comfortable with. And does it end up being the front runner in terms of, certainly from the UK perspective, its way of remaining connected to European foreign policy when it can't have much of a say in EU foreign policy? So to draw things to a conclusion, if I may, clearly the foreign security and defence policy issues are overshadowed by Brexit, and obviously everything's overshadowed by the COVID question at the moment. So it seems perhaps a bit of a luxury to be talking about Brexit or a Brexit associated issue at this moment in time. but it's obviously an issue that remains unresolved. And I think that there is this question as to the extent to which EU and UK interests remain coincidental across time. Obviously, as a former EU member state, the UK has been involved in defining what EU foreign policy positions are. But as time goes on, do we start to see gaps emerge between member states and the UK on Russia, on China? There's other issues that people could bring up in the Q&A. And is, or the way that third country relationships have operated in the past and the way in which the mandate's been drawn for the future relationship negotiations, which are ongoing, will that end up limiting what otherwise might be a sort of future, a positive relationship that could exist? It may end up conditioning or limiting the ambition. And certainly for the UK, I think one of the things that's very, very striking is the UK has, or the current UK government, the Johnson administration, I think has gradually, not so gradually perhaps, moved itself away from the ambitions that were in the political declaration. And certainly foreign security and defence policy is not something that has had prominence when you look at the Johnson administration pronouncements on the future EU-UK relationship. And I think most commentators see the Johnson administration actually having, in effect, distanced itself from the political declaration, even though it signed up to that declaration. So what I think we've got emerging is for those of us who are sort of EU watchers, is a model of what I call differentiated disintegration. You know, where the UK could end up moving at a much faster pace than we might have envisaged in its past as a member state, where it built policy, it worked alongside other member states through the CFSP and the CSDP, disintegrating at a relatively fast pace as a consequence of both what we've been through in the withdrawal agreement negotiations, also a sort of move away from the political declaration commitments on the part of the UK, and obviously also the timescale and the prospects of getting a future EU-UK relationship before the end of the year, maybe sending that relationship or making that relationship even more distant and more detached than might have been envisaged from when the relationship on the future EU-UK relationship was first mapped and first mooted in the aftermath of the June 2016 vote through the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration negotiations. So I will leave things there, if I may. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Richard, for this, I think, highly interesting and really deep analysis. Kolja, you have the floor, of course. I would just like to briefly remind our audience that we are indeed waiting for your questions, as we will soon move on to the Q&A. Kolja.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's been a great pleasure listening to your presentation, Richard. I basically have a couple of comments rather than questions, perhaps also to let our debate evolve afterwards. So from your perspective, from the perspective of your talk, what we basically get is a situation where potentially the UK will opt, I guess, for as much flexibility as possible in the relationship with the European Union. Of course, there are a couple of institutional questions, formats, etc., on the table, but the big, so to speak, question is how will the UK, so to speak, relate itself to Europe, to the European Union. And here, I think it would be quite interesting to look a little bit more at this from a, let's say, practical point of view when it comes to responding to crisis, when it comes to responding to bigger global issues, but also regional threats and insecurity. What are, so to speak, the moments, what are the essential situations that we could envision the UK to look for cooperation and in fact seeking the competitive advantage, as you called it, of the European Union. When would the UK try to be as close as possible to the EU in a bilateral way, but when would it also try to seek to have the EU close to itself, let's say in the UN, when it comes to cooperating in the United Nations formats, be it in the General Assembly, but I'm thinking, for example, also about the UN Security UN Security Council. And of course, I'm also thinking from a CSDP perspective into questions of, well, when would it actually make sense for the UK to actually look for, so to speak, a coalition with the European Union when it comes to CSDP missions. You mentioned the added value of the civilian missions. We know that the EU has difficulties to punch, so to speak, with regards to military missions, but the Navy, the naval missions in the Mediterranean Sea and beyond seem to be quite important contributors to CSDP. So these are a couple of comments and questions. When could we actually see the UK looking for competitive advantage? And then the other practical side is, of course, well, under which conditions would the EU be interested in actually having the UK close to its side, and when would it rather not? I think there is a lot to be said for the added value, obviously, that the UK has brought and still brings to the table when it comes to actually the projection of, so to speak, power, and when the UK would actually be very helpful to the EU. I'm thinking about in terms of capacities, I'm thinking about representational advantages, such as in the UN Security Council, but also by and large the UK's diplomatic culture, which is in a way something that may actually in the long run be missed very much in the context of let's say EU representation abroad, when we think about how the EU can actually represent foreign policy towards third partners. And I will just perhaps add one more thing, because I don't want to speak too long to my comments, and that is, well, you know, what we may do not really oversee, and what will still be very important is the question, of course, of trust building. In the end, obviously, you talked about the Europeanization, the Brusselsization. That is, in a way, the ongoing exchange of information, but also the ongoing daily practice of actually building trust amongst member states, to treat them as basically the first ones to be contacted. You know, the very important coordination reflex that we have been talking so much about in the context of CFSP, the Common Foreign and Security Policy. When is that potentially no longer the case? Is perhaps already through Brexit trust being lost on the way, and how could it be reinstalled? And of course, this is why we are looking for the institutional mechanisms, and that this is why people are thinking about not only how to informally but also to formally establish a relationship beyond the transition phase. I would be very curious to hear your points on that. And if you allow me a very last point of view, what can we expect the UK to be looking at when it looks at the European Union? From the United States, we know that it is more and more looking at Europe rather as a theater, and not that much anymore as, let's say, an ally or a partner in the first place. It's rather, you know, a territory you have to deal with in the big political shifts that we seemingly undergo. What would be your take on this? How is the UK, let's say, looking at Europe in 5 or 10 years' time?
Thank you.
And I think I'll leave it here, Alex.
Thank you very much for all of those, which were absolutely fascinating points. And I don't know if I can show my face as opposed to hide behind a slide, but I'll try and do that if that's possible. Good. Thank you. Maybe to start where you finished, you know, the issue of trust and the issue of what the UK is looking at, because I think the issue. I think the issue of trust is a fascinating one, because, you know, trust is the principal currency of a diplomatic relationship, a deep diplomatic relationship between any two entities. And I think we would obviously be remiss if we didn't reflect on the fact that the whole withdrawal agreement negotiating experience and some of the let's say some of the vicissitudes of British politics over they have done a lot, I think, to overdraw the goodwill and to diminish the trust that the UK had previously on the part of its relationship with some of its neighbours. And how quickly you can recoup that, I think, connects to your point about you know, what we're looking at, or the way that the UK is thinking about Europe. And I'm not sure, to be frank, if you look at British politicians, that they've spent a lot of time thinking about what kind of relationship they want to have with the EU in the future. Where, I mean, essentially we've pulled apart our political parties and pulled apart our parliament for the purposes of negotiating a departure from the EU, and we obviously haven't spent the time that needs to be spent in thinking about how you put the relationship back together and what kind of ambitions that you have. And I think that takes me to the point that you made about the sort of the closeness, if you like, between the EU and the UK. I think if you were being optimistic about the future relationship, I think you would say that the challenge is to sort of preserve the West, and the question then perhaps reasonably asked by third countries with some of the behaviour that the UK has engaged in over the last little while is how far it sees itself as being a rock solid member of the West and an upholder of the Western order. And I think actually that's going to be one of the things that you can already see as a bit of a nascent debate in the UK about COVID and the relationship with China in particular. And I think there's something in there to work on and to think about and to look at the way in which the UK's role in its broader set of relationships, bilateral, multilateral, and so on, seeks to cleave to a particular view about, the value of international institutions and the rule-governed international order, and so on. But absolutely crucially, what kind of partner or challenger the US is going to be to all of that, and that takes us to whether we get a Trump second term or not. But I think there are some grounds to be a little bit optimistic, which is to your first point or series of points you made about how the UK relates itself to Europe and the EU. And I think we've already had a major test through the tail end of the withdrawal agreement negotiation process, which has been on the JCPOA. And the fact that the UK, despite perhaps a bit of misplaced rhetorical flourish from Boris Johnson on one occasion, has really kept cleaved to a strong commitment to the JCPOA and how the ongoing process with Iran can be maintained and has sort of kept alive that proposition. And also, as you're probably aware, also pushed on with the implementation of the new clearing payment arrangements for trade with Iran. So I think all of that to me signals that the UK actually sees itself and will see itself actually as much more of a Europe and EU centric aligned state than might otherwise have been the case conveyed through the Brexit negotiations. And some of the things that you flagged up, for example, on CSDP and naval missions and so on, I think that that one might be optimistic about the way in which the UK anxiety about the US could be hitched to the need to have a more creative rethink on both sides about how you keep the UK connected. It's not, I think the UK sort of politically and certainly parliamentary, politically at the moment won't be until the end of the transition period. But I'm reasonably optimistic that in the medium and the long term, that the interests will act, and the UK obviously has a strong interest in a stable and successful EU, and therefore the sort of departure points of departure of the UK from EU policy positions will be at the margins. Although I think my big test it's probably going to be China, and that's something that somebody may have a question on or may have a view on. That would be interesting to hear.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Excellent. Yes, thank you so much for that. I think unless Kolja, you have any urgent remarks, we can move on.
Oh, I think we should open up.
We can move on to the Q&A session. I would like to start with a couple of questions that point to how cooperation, particularly in this field, might be changing. We have, in particular, a question from Maxine David, who asks, in relation to how you've mentioned that the UK might be willing to work with EU member states outside the EU framework, but not, of course, with the intention of undermining the EU as a foreign policy actor. Even if we can agree on the intention, isn't there the risk that the EU will, in terms of suffer in terms of particularly perceptions and outcomes. And the case of Russia is mentioned as a country that typically is sought to work bilaterally, but has often been vilified because of this particular choice. And then there's an additional question with regard to in relation to the European Security Council, and is there a model for Russia to be included there? Something along the lines of what Medvedev called for in the context of a new European security architecture. And then on a similar note, we have a question which relates, of course, to the special relationship between the UK and the United States, and whether you see this post-Brexit phase in the area of security and defence cooperation as strengthening UK-USA relations in this area. We have then a question from George William Lamb, who asks whether the relationship that existed between the UK and the EU during the Cameron premiership between 2010 and 2016, would you evaluate it as a positive or negative partnership, and is there anything that can be learned as the UK and the EU look to developing a new framework for cooperation? And then we have a sort of broader question with regards to EU integration on cooperation on defence and security from Carlo Panara, who asks whether, if there has been an acceleration in this particular area, is it in fact the product of the UK distancing itself from the EU and allowing for closer cooperation among the remaining member states? Perhaps we can begin with this first round, and then perhaps we can have an additional round of questions.
Thank you very much for the questions. I'm glad that everybody got the easy ones in, and that's classic British understated humour, by the way, which doesn't work on these kind of platforms. And thank you to Maxine. I'm very grateful for her bringing the question of in and both in the sense of I think how sort of Russia fits into the architecture, but also working with sort of states outside the framework. Because the really interesting question, I think, for me, and I think Maxine alludes to this very well, is, with the UK on the outside, we now have three large European states, UK, Turkey, and Russia, who are outside of the EU framework. And from the EU's perspective, what's the most efficient and effective way of managing those three states? I mean, they all throw up different kinds of challenges. They obviously all come from very different perspectives, and I wouldn't suggest that they're in the same category. And certainly, it would be entirely inappropriate to suggest that the UK is putting itself into a position that's akin to Russia's challenger position on the EU's role and on the sort of European security order more generally. But I think there is this fascinating question as to the way in which you manage European security with that new kind of structure, and whether there's the need for any new sort of institutional order. And I mentioned the E3 earlier, but if you think about the E3 and Russia and Ukraine, the UK was not drawn into the Normandy format. And does that tell us something about the limits of E3 cooperation? Does that tell us something about the poor quality of the relationship with the Cameron administration? I'll come back to that point in a moment from George's question. But I think that there are, for me, a whole range of issues that Maxine raises, which take us to this question of, whether the UK is likely to be a state which intentionally or unintentionally has a disruptive impact on the international relations of Europe, and what the longer term effects of Brexit actually are, which we could speculate at. And I think they're fascinating questions that we're only now just starting to chew over. And as I suggested, this question of how the UK does bilateral, unilateral, and so on is a really interesting, really interesting question. And Maxine's question was also the special relationship one as well. Was that from somebody else?
That was a couple of attendees. We have, I think, Philip Dingemans, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and also Mansi Suri were both asking that question.
Well, thank you to Philip and Mansi, and the special relationship question. The UK is obviously in the worst of all possible worlds in terms of its broad strategy for its place in the world, which has been since the early 1970s to have these two pillars to what was sometimes called a bridging strategy, a transatlantic bridging strategy with one pillar in Europe and a relationship with the US and the UK playing some kind of role, some kind of bridging role in the transatlantic relationship. I mean, we can argue whether that was a sort of British delusion or not, but it was an important organizing principle, I think, for British thinking about its place in the world, its place in Europe, and its relationship to the United States. And clearly Brexit has disappeared one side of that bridge, and the Trump administration has dynamited the other side. And is often the case with shifts in the US view of the world, to come to terms with what those shifts have been. And that's almost a kind of perennial in the neurosis that exists at the heart of British foreign policy about the relationship with the US. How do we respond to the US when it appears the US is not thinking about us as much as we think they should think about us? And it happened over Vietnam. It happened through the 1970s, and it's certainly the case now with the Trump administration. And I think what we have for the UK, or what the UK has adopted, is in effect using almost all of the baubles and the gilt meaning GILT bit, the shiny bits of Britain in terms of the monarchy and so on, state visits and that kind of stuff, to flatter Mr. Trump, which is a bit of a strategy of desperation because we find it quite difficult to connect to him in all sorts of other ways, but also at the same time just hanging in there in the hope that the sort of sinews of the relationship in the intelligence, the defense and diplomatic communities will be enough to see us through. And if they're not, and if we get a second Trump administration, then I think the UK is in a very, very difficult position. And you might see then a sort of boomeranging back to Europe and to the EU, and that will be something that interesting to watch, but I think also highly complicating for the UK. And maybe that's a way of linking to George's question about the Cameron administration. And for me, the sort of failing of British government and British Parliament, and I think British political class over the last 20 odd years, certainly from the late Blair period, Brown period onwards, was the relative neglect of relationships with political parties underneath the head of state level, and the fact that Cameron obviously decided to go somewhere else in terms of not taking the Tory party out of the EPP, but also despite the fact they're very good friends of the UK, very good parliamentary friends of the UK and Germany in particular, those kind of relationships and that sort of trust, back to the trust question, that is essential to see a good, broad-based understanding of one another and the ability to connect between countries was squandered and I think neglected. And one of the ways in which the UK is clearly going to have to think about Europe from top to bottom is rebuilding those relationships that was, to my mind, sort of scandalously neglected and abused, I think. And that's a long old haul, actually. And I think that's almost, we have to wait for a new generation of parliamentarians in the UK who realise that Europe's important for the UK, interested and intrigued by other European countries, feel that they've got something to learn, rather than the UK being an exception that can always do things better than almost anywhere else. And through that, you build the kind of contacts that existed through the Cold War, which were kind of intuitive understandings of the way that people thought and felt in other countries, and which our diplomats obviously also work to keep alive. But to me, Parliament in a way is where the work is to be done, and British parliamentarians. I don't think there's a link in that to the question. Was it from Cameron? I didn't hear the name. Cameron Panada.
The question about David Cameron, you were saying.
No. This is the question. There was a question about EU defence integration.
Oh, right. Yes,
but I didn't quite hear the name.
That's Carlo Panara.
Oh, Carlo. Okay. Well, thank you very much again for the question. I mean, this is the kind of thing that actually keeps EU foreign and defence policy analysts busy. I think, which is the extent to which, or rather to what extent, were there different drivers for the deepening of EU defence integration and the extent to which Brexit facilitated a process that was otherwise retarded or complicated by the UK being a member state. And I think it's probably fair to say that all sorts of things that the UK had found difficult, like the creation of the MPCC and so on, all took place as the UK was on the way out. So I think there's no question that the UK was an obstructor to some aspects of the way in which you evolve the EU's defence policy in terms of some instruments and some reforms. But to go back to one of my early slides, I don't think it's entirely fair to the UK to say that it was so hostile to the process that it didn't want it to succeed. I think that there was an approach on the part of the UK which was orientated towards privileging certain kinds of focus for the development of EU defence, which was capabilities driven. And I think where we are at the moment, but also perhaps with the EU, which is more tricky, which is the UK excuse disappears. So for other member states who may be more sceptical about the value of CSDP, they have to decide the extent to which they want to move down the path that's being suggested. But also, I think there's the question of realising the ambition of strategic autonomy without the UK, and I think that's back to one of the questions that Kolja raised in his remarks. How you connect with the UK. How the UK is there, providing a sort of supporting relationship to the EU's ambitions, recognising that the UK has political difficulties with perhaps defence integration as a project, but should be fairly central to any undertaking to build a capacity for strategic autonomy, even if it's a bridging strategy. That the UK is there to fill certain kinds of holes until such a time that other member states might be willing to do so. And for the UK, I think the sensible thing, back to a Trump 2 administration, is the UK obviously has to be in a position in which it has a plan B for European security. If we do see, a Trump administration fatally undermining NATO as it's currently constituted, and that's something that's very, very central to sort of British thinking about European security. So if in that space somewhere you're able to, find a way to work together and to communicate, I think that's an obvious benefit for both sides, but one that it may be difficult, particularly from the UK side, for it to see clearly at the moment.
Thank you so much for that. I think we can definitely have an additional round of questions, and I think there are a couple of points that have been raised by the audience that point to how you were mentioning that it seems that at the moment security and defence, and perhaps foreign policy more broadly, is not really a key priority for the current administration in the UK. And we have a particular question a general question from Charles Carnegie, who asks whether indeed the UK will have a diminished global role in foreign policy, and what are the prospects of the UK pivoting towards the Commonwealth, which of course has been often mentioned as the alternative club that the UK can turn to, of course. And then we also have a question from Aris Georgopoulos, who wonders what are the reasons for and against particularly defence and security industrial cooperation between the European Union and the UK. And then I think a very interesting point from Jean-François Clouzet, who highlights how the third country club, as he defines it, is less and less closed, particularly in terms of security. Will the negotiation of specific agreements not become more difficult or even more competitive, seeing as Switzerland is perceiving the UK as a competitor in this area, and perhaps other countries might have a similar perception. And then we have a question from Sara Poli, who goes to the specific issue of UK sanction policy and how likely the UK is to align to EU sanctions. And of course, there may be cases where there could be frictions between the EU and the UK and how that might play out. And then we have an additional question from Philip again, who wonders, from a kind of broader global governance perspective, how does China fit into the growing importance of bilateralism in this area of cooperation from a UK and indeed also EU perspective?
Well, thank you again for all of those questions. They're absolutely fantastic, and I'll try my best to address each of them in turn. You know, Charles's question, I think, about the sort of UK role and putatively diminished role, and new reinvigorating, shall we say, or re-enlivening older relationships. This proposition that the UK might want to pursue new relationships or deepen new relationships has been a very strong signal that's been sent by London to UK embassies in third countries. This is the job of work that they have to do, particularly in Commonwealth states, and to find all sorts of ways and all sorts of ways and means to try and ginger up some of those relationships, particularly Australia and New Zealand, where there's a desire to strike early trade deals with those countries. But I think the question that's begged in those relationships, and if you think about the Commonwealth framework, is what does that structure provide for the UK that it couldn't get elsewhere in a more efficient fashion? So, for example, with Australia and New Zealand, along with Canada and the US, there's obviously the Five Eyes relationship, which is valued by those countries for particular purposes. But if you then start to step out from that relationship and you think about the trading relationship between those countries, then they have quite different needs and they're important to the UK in quite different ways in terms of the volume of trade in goods and services with those countries. And further out to other members of the Commonwealth as well. I think the Commonwealth is a vehicle for the UK to act as an effective replacement for what the UK might have lost in leaving the EU.
Richard,
that's something which is a viable proposition. But back to the point I made in my earlier remarks, I mean, I think that there's been a real struggle to turn the global Britain idea into anything much more than a fairly empty slogan, and therefore that's a bit tricky, I think. On to Aris's point. I'm not sure I fully understood the point about international cooperation. Maybe you could just run it by me again, if that's okay.
I think the question was, what are the reasons for and against cooperation in the area of defense and security, industrial cooperation more specifically?
Oh, I see. Yeah, sorry, that's my handwriting where I was scribbling down.
Okay.
Thank you for that. Well, I mean, for the UK, I mean, the UK is already connected in all sorts of ways with continental European defence industry, but the UK is also has a defence industrial sector which is also susceptible to takeover by US companies, which has happened recently with a company called Cobham, and also is very susceptible, I think, in terms of some of the markets that the UK has targeted, and Saudi Arabia is likely to be in a very difficult position in the future if the strange things that have happened to the oil price continue for any time to come, which is a major customer for UK defence industry. So I think that the UK's broad choices, or UK defence industry's broad choices outside of the UK government as its purchaser are either places where you see defence expenditure increasing, and they've got a bit of that action, as I say, with places like Saudi Arabia, facilitated by the war that it's conducted in Yemen. But also there is this vulnerability, I think, to being able to stand on its own 2 feet, particularly if you want to have access to the US market. And what we have in place so far in terms of how the UK's thought about the future relationship with the EU, I think it just gets more and more difficult to do defence industrial cooperation with the EU in the way that it's currently envisaged. And you could therefore see that UK defence industry has a more problematic future than was the case before Brexit. On Jean-Francois's questions about the third country club and mentioning Switzerland, I mean, the relationship in broad terms, or the interesting question perhaps for third countries which are not EU members, like Norway and Switzerland, and where I think there's been a bit of interest in the consequences of Brexit, is what are the implications for them in their negotiations and their future relationship with the EU, and what kind of consequences for the UK being out in terms of the kind of deal that the UK gets. I think one thing that's manifestly clear is that the UK is not going to be able to pursue a policy of sort of back to the future, where it basically goes back to EFTA and uses EFTA as a kind of vehicle as an alternative to the EU, which was the policy that it tried or pursued in the 1960s. That's not going to work. I mean, not least because the other EFTA member states are very wary of doing so. And on Calvo's question, I think, was it Calvo? No, Sana's question, I think, about sanctions policy. Here, I think that you will see there are very interesting developments already because of the importance of London and London as a financial centre to sanctions regime. That's where you've seen a lot of work being done on the UK side to build its own sanctions regime, its own national sanctions regime post-Brexit. And there's a really active debate as to whether the mechanics of a UK sanctions regime should lean more towards the US model than is currently the case. And I think that is still working itself out. But I think for the EU, the UK being aligned with EU sanctions is absolutely crucial for the UK. I think the question is slightly different, which is where it wants to go beyond EU sanctions, and Russia being an example of that, perhaps cleaving much more to a US style sanctions regime. And on Philip's question about China, here, I think is a really, really interesting issue to watch when you look at the UK. I mean, there is clearly a debate and a dispute and a significant difference opening up on the right in British politics. David Cameron pursued a policy of seeking a very close relationship with China. Theresa May distanced herself from that. Within the UK, we've just been through a major spat over the 5G Huawei issue, which I think is going to come back in the UK post-COVID, or as a consequence of COVID, about UK cooperation with China and on whether the right approach was being pursued on 5G, particularly because it was a different approach from the approach that the US was pursuing. Well, I think China for the UK is going to be one of these issues where I think it may end up seeking to have a policy that sort of bridges the US policy and the EU policy, which is a sort of mid-Atlanticist position where on the one hand, seeking to work with China to try and put in place replacement arrangements for the kind of things that the US is walking away from, for example, dispute resolution within the WTO and international environmental policy. So you see, the kind of UK more sort of on the European end of things in the relationship with China. But on the sort of security issues, I can only see the UK getting more hawkish, and certainly the voices within the Conservative Party and within Parliament, which have argued for a more hawkish position on China, seem to have got much louder over the last few weeks. So I think that would be a case to watch.
Thank you so much, Richard, for these additional clarifications and developments. Kolja, would you like to give us any additional remarks from your side?
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you very much, Richard. I think I would like to basically congratulate everybody to this excellent debate. And I think, Richard, you've really kicked off a debate which helps us to get around so many different questions in relation to the UK-EU relationship that it makes it very difficult now to tap into specific fields. But indeed, I think that when we really think about the future cooperation, the latter issues that we talked about, specifically defense and security cooperation, will be very, very important, and in fact something that we have to think about in the future, because there are also so many transnational aspects and interests, economic interests involved, which go far beyond the security and foreign policy dimension.
Thank you so much. And Richard, would you like to give us any concluding remarks from your side?
Well, I think people have had to listen to me long enough banging on about the topic, but maybe my final reflections would be that the kind of broader discussion about the West and how the West hangs together may end up being far more significant in terms of how we see the relationship evolve than what we might call the sort of nerdy or train spotting focus on the nuts and bolts of the EU-UK relationship. So it may not end up being a great paradox that the kind of institutional connectivity is really difficult to do because of red lines or constraints on both sides, but actually the broader analysis and the broader cooperation through all sorts of means and the sort of shared outlook as to what the challenges really are holds up reasonably well. And then for me, the question then is that kind of a failing, or should the EU learn from that? That maybe that the let's say the particular approach towards institutional connectivity makes life unnecessarily difficult for the EU if it wants to be more geopolitical and a more geopolitical player. And from the UK perspective, it's a kind of reminder that having gone through the Brexit experience, that the UK, through a very, very painful and divisive or politically divisive, socially divisive process, has ended up realizing how much more European it is than it thought it was.
And on that note, that is all the time that we have for today. I would like to really thank our speaker, Professor Richard Whitman, for this wonderful EU Cross webinar. and of course also Professor Kolja Raube, as well as our audience members for taking part in this webinar. On Friday 24th, we are hosting a webinar with Professor Randall Henning from American University, Washington, DC, on regional financial arrangements and the IMF, the challenge of the COVID-19 crisis. And on April 30th, we will host Professor Ole Ostvik from the Norway University of Applied Sciences on Europe and the new geopolitics of energy. For details on the registration, please visit our Twitter page @EUCross. Thank you for joining us, and we really hope you will join us again next time. Wishing you all the best. From Richard, Kolja, and myself, it's thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.